Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next session in our ITEP Spring 2025 cohort, whatever we're calling it. But today we're going to be talking about kind of the mechanics of creating your business story. And really, what do we mean by business story? And your business story is how you're kind of approaching things that you're doing. You're creating that initial thought of, here's who I am, here's what's happening, here's where we're going. And how do you kind of almost demarcate that for your audience? And your audience, 99% of the time, is either going to be your customer or a potential partner, whether it's an investment partner, whether it's a manufacturing partner, even whether it's a granting partner like NIH or another SBIR, ST-tier agency. And there's a few things that really kind of go into what tells a good story about your business. And when we're really talking about story, we're talking about success because that's what we want to see in a business story. How are you going to be successful? Where are you going to be in the next 5 to 10 years? How does that line up with your overall kind of vision, your overall goal, almost that mission statement for we are this, here's what we want to be, here's how we're going to be it. So those are kind of the overall like concepts we're going to talk about in today's session. But as a quick just reminder of the review of last session. So just like Arsh took my review from last session for his presentation last week, I also took his. So last week, Arsh talked about a few different things, and these were the four kind of high-level bullets. How you build that relationship with users, customers, and partners, like customer discovery and validation, defining partners, collaborators, and co-opposition for growth and success, and those kind of business timing concerns and opportunity cost. So just to kind of give you a real brief overview of each one of those. So when we're talking about building new relationships with users, customers, and partners, how are you going to get to them? How are you actually going to entice them? How are you going to engage them? How are you going to make them interested in continuing that conversation? Whether it is a conversation about, I want to buy this, or whether it's a conversation about, you seem like you actually have a really great setup here. Will you take funding for it? Or whether it's a conversation on, you're the best beneficiary for what we're doing. You may not be my customer, but I need to make sure what I'm doing actually matches your needs. You want to continue to just kind of grow those relationships. Because one of the things that you'll find about actually being successful about your business, it's not just about initially making a relationship and initially making that kind of foray into those, potential connections, but it's about maintaining them. And it's a factor, statistic, whatever you want to call it, that's been thrown around multiple times, and there's multiple studies that show it. It's about roughly 3 times more expensive to make a customer than it is to keep one. So once someone knows what you're doing, they're interested, they're engaged, you kind of need to keep them in the loop. And a big part of that is going to be into that like customer discovery and validation. As we talked about last week, when we talk about things like assumptions, it's not a bad thing. Assumptions are what you're going to do. They're kind of your hypothesis about the business, about being a business, about who it is, about what you're doing, about who's interested in what you're creating and why, about why would they pay for it. That entire process is just coming up with an idea and then going out and testing it. And the way you test it is you go out and you talk to people. Just find more out, find out about what drives them, find out about, what keeps them moving forward, find out about what it is that is actually the critical issue that they need solved. Because one of the things you'll often find is that you may think you understand the problem, but until you've done the proverbial walk a mile in someone's shoes, you actually don't really get it. You don't understand like the after effects. You don't understand how things flow down from there. Until you've sat in the environment and seen it in action, there are things that you just will kind of gloss over because your customer glosses over it. if it's a normal functioning part of their day, and you would ask them to describe their day, they're going to forget about the minutia. But a lot of times that minutia actually drives how you need to make something that actually fits their most valuable need and creates that, you know, value proposition for them. And that also goes along with, figuring out differences between partners, collaborators, and co-opposition. Those partners are the ones that are going to make a relationship with you based on mutual benefit. There's something that they need from you, there's something you need from them, and you're going to work together to, get a mutual agreement out of it, get some sort of mutual benefit out of that. And that co-opposition acts in a very similar way where you find people that are in the same space. You may be actually kind of competing against them, but there's something you can do together, like a joint venture, or, whether it is actually a proposal where they're the sub award or something like that, where you'll both actually benefit from it. And the collaborators is almost like a meeting between the two where they're actually helping you get to a stage, not because maybe they benefit from it, but because it's something that's, good for them, or it's something that's really good for you and it serves their mission. So, don't be afraid to get that outside help. Don't be afraid to pull in those resources that will, kind of help you move forward, because there's a lot of resources out there. And we're actually going to talk about those different resources, I think, in the next presentation. And just always keep in mind, and it's something that'll be reflected throughout all of these presentations, throughout all of these different weeks. Make the decision that's best for your business at the time. Don't worry about making those decisions where you go, this will actually be really great for me 5 years in the future. Businesses live and die, month to month, week to week, day to day, hour to hour. Heck, sometimes for a small startup, you live and die minute to minute. So do those timing things. Go, okay, I need to do this because it's going to pay off within, a day. It's going to pay off within a week. It's going to pay off within a month. If it's something that's like, well, this will be really great for me 10 years from now, but it's going to sink the company until then. Well, guess what? You no longer have a company. That's that kind of opportunity cost where to go after something, you're actually giving up doing something else. So just like people say, make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze. But that's our review of last session. So what are we talking about this session? Well, this session, again, we're talking about those mechanisms for what actually tells the story about what your business is, what it does, and why people should care, why people should pay attention, why people should, quote unquote, buy that story. And the four kind of big mechanisms for that are really understanding what it is to be a business, what it is to actually kind of make money, which is just revenue. Anytime your business is making money, that's what we mean by revenue. It doesn't mean that it has to be a specific product, even a specific product line. If there's something that is generating positive cash flow for your business, that's just revenue. But to get in revenue, you have to actually create a model for it. So kind of what are the mechanisms for that? And then next thing we're going to kind of really focus on is determining your market. There's a really big thing that happens when you look at your market, and your market is just the overall collective group of people that would be able to purchase your product and would have a need that is, met by purchasing your product. But there's these different kind of segmentations and almost that stratiations based on who they are, what they're doing, why there's something that they need, and how you're actually going to kind of deliver it to them. Then we're going to talk about kind of defining those competitors and those differentiators, because no matter who you are, no matter what you're doing, no matter what you're developing, no matter how innovative and cutting edge it is, there's always competition. Even not solving the problem is technically competition. So you have to know what else is out there. You have to know who else is out there, and you have to know why you're different, because those differentiators actually drive what is the, progressive benefit of your business itself? What is that thing that you're doing that separates you out from the pack? If you're just running with the pack when it comes to your product, probably not going to be, healthy and successful as a business because you're not able to kind of stand out. You're not able to do that thing that everybody else is going to notice. And then finally, we're going to jump into kind of just understanding, value proposition, because that's kind of that culminator amongst these, other three areas, let's call it. Because that value proposition is just point blank. You know who your customer is, you know your business model, you know your market, you know your competitors and your differentiators. Well, that drives the value proposition of why someone actually buys from you, why someone buys your product. What is that thing that you deliver to them that is of an overall positive benefit that they don't get from somebody else or something else? So, revenue and business models. And as always, when we're going through, feel free to drop questions in the chat. I know that Devia, Constantine, and Chris are in the session today. They'll be able to answer questions, address questions. I also have it up in a secondary monitor because I can't work unless I have two monitors. So I'll be able to glance at it throughout, because these are for a lot of people, these are going to be kind of high level concepts, and they're going to be, for some of you, your first introduction. And some of these are very nebulous. They're very abstract concepts, so it gets hard to kind of figure out, well, what do you actually mean by this? So let's go ahead and get started here. Revenue. So again, revenue is just the way that you're actually making money for your business. It doesn't need to be just straight out sales. There's all kinds of different ways that your business can actually start to make, what we call cash. And when we talk about cash flow and we talk about cash, we're not necessarily meaning like greenbacks, like you open up your wallet, you pull out some bills, that's cash. Cash flow here is just anything that's coming in. So even if it's just a kind of barter for goods, like if you went to the farmer's market and instead of paying $5 for a bundle of carrots, you traded them a chicken, that would still be cash flow. That would actually be revenue because it is a positive benefit from you doing something. So, and that's why, when we talk about kind of revenue, we also talk about things like sales, partnerships, licensing fees, everything like that. Because for partnerships and counting it as kind of that revenue and that revenue flow, it's not really that it provides you money in, but most of the time it actually reduces your overall cost so that you actually make greater profit off of the money that has already come in. Because it's something that kind of reduces that I have to do this to do this other thing. Now, those are kind of not really outliers. They happen all the time in business, but they're not really the main thrust, because the main thrust will always be I'm selling a product. And again, think back to what Chris presented on. Product is just the way that you're actually making this money. Product is the way that you're generating that cash flow, whether it is a physical thing, a widget that you've created, whether it's an idea that you actually license out for somebody else to use, whether it's a concept that you sell as kind of a package for, service, delivery, logistics, anything like that. That's something that in and of itself could be a product. But you have to know how you're going to kind of deliver that product to people. How is it going to get out there into that marketplace? How are you going to receive the payment for that product? Whatever it is. How are you going to inform people about that product? How are you going to continue to develop multiple products? Because with these agencies and these programs, they're actually at the heart of it, not really interested in you developing a product. They're really interested in developing a, successful and healthy business. And a successful and healthy business doesn't have a product. They have a product line. They have depth and breadth for a product line. it's one of these things that you don't just have like a Sony doesn't have a specific model of TV and they only sell 60-inch LCDs. They sell 55-inch, they sell UWBs, they sell all of these different things, but televisions is a product line for them. And so that's kind of where ultimately, not only the agencies and like any of your investors want you to be, heck, that's where we want you to be too, because you can't really be that successful off of that one thing. If you only have one thing, well, what happens when somebody else comes out with something that maybe is a little bit better than it, maybe actually solves a different problem that cuts into it? All of a sudden, you're shutting down your business, you're laying off people, you're doing these things because you can't compete anymore. So that's why it's so important when we talk about that kind of ideation of a product in your business. We're really talking about those longer term goals. Yes, you do have to figure out how to be viable for 3 to 5 years, but what does your business look like in 20 years? What does it look like in 30 years? What does it look like in hopefully 100 years? Are you that new Johnson and Johnson or Merck Meyer or whoever? So all of that kind of wraps into that revenue generation plan. When you think about generating revenue, what is that primary way that you're actually going to deliver something that people go, yeah, I'll buy that. Or, yeah, I'll trade for that. Or, yeah, we need that in some fashion. And, that kind of revenue generation, and it's not just the how are you going to make money, where are you going to make money, but what does that money actually do for you? And that's also why you have to start thinking about those longer term and bigger impacts too, because revenue is actually directly related and linked to the ability to kind of grow your company. If you have, stagnating revenues or dropping revenues, you can't bring in more people. You can't hire more people. You can't do more things. You actually can't develop multiple products then because you're trying to, rob from Peter to pay Paul just to get the light, keep the lights on in the place. There's that old adage about you have to spend money to make money. And that's very true. Particularly when we think about revenue generation and business models, that actually moves very quickly outside of the, scientific or technical arena. And it moves extremely fast into the business arena. For a lot of y'all that are, developing your product, it's going to start to get into things like marketing. It's going to start to get into things like developing sales channels. It's going to start getting into things like, partnerships and agreements and everything that is just, okay, I don't know anything about that. And again, as Arsh talked about, last week, that's where you start looking at those, partners, those collaborators, consultants, advisory boards, things like that for people to help you figure out. I have an idea for how I'm going to generate revenue, but what does that revenue need to be used for? How does that make, my company healthier and make my company able to grow? Because again, it's always about looking for that next step. We're here right now. We want to be here. How do we get there? What is the tool that we actually tap into? What is the resource? Because eventually you need to be able to cover all of your operating and operational costs and then make something extra on top of it, because that's the profit. That's where, money goes back into the business so that you can do that long-term development. Maybe you have a partnership for manufacturing and, distribution agreement, and you go, but we could be making so much more, have such a bigger impact if we had our own manufacturing line. Well, guess what? You have to use that profit to actually develop that so that you can actually utilize that in the future, so that you can actually, make more money in the future, so that you can actually have a holistic solution yourself and don't have to worry about, QA and quality analysis and like quality control in the future. All of those things that are markers of if you're growing, if you're thriving, if you're kind of utilizing that revenue well, you're going to continue to grow and continue to actually make profit and be able to reinvest into the company so that you can do more stuff. Now, one of the big things that actually comes about when you start thinking about revenue generation, and this actually goes into directly into kind of thinking about that, 20 years in the future, is you need to be able to start projecting things. Every time we talk about revenue is not really that kind of day-to-day thing because things happen day to day that you have no control over. Things happen month to month. Revenue projection is really based on quarters and annual. People look at things on a quarterly basis. They go, are we being well? Are we actually doing things that are going to set us up for the future? How is a changing market like affecting us? And those annual projections are what people are going to be interested in. When you give a presentation to potential investors, they're going to want to know, okay, well, what's that cash flow? What is that kind of revenue projection for the next 1, 3, 5 years? Because if they're making that investment, it's going to be that long-term kind of almost collaboration between you and the investor. It's really actually a partnership, but let's just call it a collaboration for the moment. They don't make an investment and go, okay, within 90 days, we want this money back. That's a loan. If you need a loan, go after a loan. Totally different from the way an investment works. But very similarly, for the SBIR and STTR programs, when an agency actually gives you phase 1 and phase 2 funding, they're looking at that same thing. Because again, the way that these agencies get their money back, and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we talk about, when we start focusing on SBIR and STTR, is if your company is healthy, if your company is successful, well, you release more products, you hire more people, you pay more in wages, they get their return on investment by, increased tax base, increased cash flow, things like that. So even with these programs, and you do something like your phase 2 commercialization plan, you need to be able to project that 1, 3, 5 years. You have these assumptions about what your product is, what you're going to charge for it. Well, what does that actually mean for, your revenue? Where are you going to go? How are you going to grow? Will the market actually accept that? And that's why we're going to talk about market, here coming up shortly. We're going to really focus also on looking at that market and looking at the positives of it, looking at the negatives of it, looking at the influencers of it, and talking about something called a CAGR, which is a compound annual growth rate. People know that markets grow over time because people have more money over time. You have more customers over time. Even with everything happening over the past decade, population growth is still on a rapid pace. It's still on a not an exponential, but it's still on an arithmetic progression. So there's going to be more people out there. But when looking at that kind of projections, it's knowing how that market can shift over time and knowing what are going to be those drivers for those shifts. Great example here. If there are only 600 hospitals that actually can utilize the product that you're developing, and each of them would be able to buy 2 of them, well, then your projection should reflect that. You have 1,200 customers. You can hit 100 of them the first year. You add 300 more the second year, and then you top that out with the last 200 the third year. You can't say, okay, well, I have this many customers, so I'm going to be able to sell 48,000 products, within the first 3 years, because people just look at it and they go, well, that doesn't match. You already told me who your customer is. You already told me how many of these they could buy. Now you're telling me you're going to sell 8 times that amount. What? Where's the connection point there? People are going to get lost because your projections have to make sense. And it also should be staggered for that kind of positive growth over time because, just like, population increases, just like your customers increase, just like that, as I mentioned, that CAGR increases, your ability to enter and deliver to more people is going to increase over time, just because you're going to be able to, figure things out. You're actually going to be able to start to impact that revenue growth because maybe a way that you develop or maybe a way that you produce gets better over time. So you can actually cut cost. Or maybe your marketing department actually grows and you're able to actually get more interest and you're able to, visit more conferences and have those one-on-one sessions with, the business development teams there or the small business liaisons that go, okay, well, this is something we can use. Let's start to have these discussions. As your name starts to grow, people are going to be more interested in you. And so that's why every time you have that kind of revenue projection, it's that kind of staggered growth, because as people figure things out and as people actually are more interested in it, there's a economic model here called an adoption curve, and it actually models the phenomena very well. Arsh talked about it kind of very briefly when he talked about kind of customers and thinking about longer term customers last week, but when we talk about kind of that, customer adoption model, here's what we're actually talking about. And this is a model that's been used for, oh God, something like 35 or 40 years. It's actually pretty true. You kind of have these stages when it comes to that customer interaction and that customer, what we call capture. You have those bleeding edge. They're called enthusiast here. Usually we would call them like innovators for anything else, because they're the ones that they don't really need to know that they can get a benefit out of it. They're the ones that are just buy things because they go, this is the latest thing out there. I need to have it. I have to be the first one to have it. When iPhones hit the market for the very first time, the people that were lining up in front of Apple stores day one, those are the enthusiasts. They go, I don't even know anything about this, but I want it. I need it. And then once you have those enthusiasts, well, then you move on to these visionaries. These are the people that go, okay, well, this seems like it's interesting. I need somebody else to kind of get through that first round. When you have a first release of something, typically it's going to be buggy. There are things that are not going to work right because, engineering problems came up, or there are things that won't completely solve the issue because maybe there was an incorrect assumption, like when you were going through product development cycles. But these visionaries kind of wait past that and they go, I don't need to be the first one. I need to know how it really works and why it works, and I need to kind of see that demonstrated. And they make up actually a really kind of big chunk of that within the first, let's call it 1 year from when you develop and release something. And then you get into these kind of pragmatics who have to see a huge value about what you are doing before they will kind of jump that ship. And so that's that value proposition. Not only do you have to have a value proposition, it has to be a documented value proposition. It has to be something that people will really understand and can actually influence them before they go, okay, I'm going to go ahead and get this. I'm going to go ahead and buy this. These are probably the 12 to 18 month market typically for, product releases. These are the people that sat back and said, okay, you have to demonstrate to me why I need this. You have to show me exactly what this does for me. You have to show me the, benefits that I will get from this for being able to, pay out this amount. I have to know that I'll get that in some sort of return for myself. And then the last kind of big bucket you have are the, more conservative people. They kind of sit back and they see how it actually stacks up against the competition. So they come after the pragmatics because the pragmatics make you deliver on that value proposition, and then the conservatives will make you deliver on that differentiator from the competitor. You've already been able to deliver value to somebody, you've already been able to show the benefits, but how does that really stack up against what other people are doing? These are the people that can be the hardest to actually flip and get them into your customer cycle, because these are generally that, maybe 24 to 36 months. And then finally, you have the skeptics. And you would think that the skeptics are the hardest to flip, but they're kind of the easiest at the end. It's just they take a while because they're the ones that are dead set in their ways. They're the ones that go, I've been doing this way for 20 years. It's fine enough for me. I am never going to change it. They're the ones that come into it, dragging their heels in the sand. You remember old Looney Tunes commercials and showing them like digging two furrows in the dirt as you drag someone along. That's these people, the skeptics. And they're not the hardest to flip because they're just going to do it. They, at the heart of it, they know that they need to do something. They know they need to buy something, but man, they just for that pride or whatever it is, they just sit there and balk at it and balk at it until they're forced to, until something actually happens that's outside of their control that they go, okay, fine, you wore me down. And whenever you're looking at this curve, this is actually a pretty good model too over kind of that 5-year cycle of like a product. You're going to have, again, those enthusiasts day one to the first like 30 days. Then you're going to have those visionaries who are the first, let's call it maybe 9 to 12 months. And then those pragmatics who come a little bit after that, conservatives around that 3-year mark, and then those skeptics at the very end who just kind of finally give in. And that's why when you think about that kind of projection and revenue growth, you're thinking about that growth over time and how this curve comes up. And now you're probably going, well, Bedell, you told me that this is 5 years, but you told me I should be growing. But after that midpoint, it's going to drop off. Well, that's where the importance comes into those kind of differentiations, because as you're developing something, you're not just creating it and kind of sitting back and going, I'm done. I did my job. We don't have to do anything else. You're also kind of, doing those upgrades, doing those developments over time. And, version 2 comes out. And then that version 2, those enthusiasts go, oh man, I really need to have this. So you see, it starts to actually overlap as you develop that kind of product line and that breadth and depth again. And then you have, competing or not competing, but complementary things, or you have those kind of upgrades, or if you have a software package, you move from a one-time, purchase to an annual purchase or a monthly purchase, or we've all seen that, no longer is the case that you can buy something like Microsoft Word. You used to be able to walk into a store, buy Office, have your lifetime, license for it and just be done with it. Now, Microsoft has their annual licenses and you can go monthly, but if you go annual, then there's a bit, reduction in cost, or you get this other thing that goes with it. And that's how you kind of keep these cycles going. So that's why you kind of have that always kind of positive growth, even when you're reaching that kind of tail end of what you're doing. Now, talked a lot about all of that stuff just to essentially say, those are kind of the drivers for your business model, because your business model is actually how you're going to do business. And a big part of doing business is, of course, making revenue, making money, making sales. But how do you get those sales? How do you get to the people that actually want to buy that? How do you make sure that when they get a product from you, it gets delivered to them? That's actually where the concept of that business model comes in, because on one hand, you have I sold this product. And on the other hand, you have well, how did I get to that person? How did I actually deliver this? How do I make sure that they're happy with what's delivered? How do I make sure that what actually got delivered to them meets their need and addresses their pain point? So that's where the concept of business model comes in, because it's that kind of, let's just call it that wrapper around your revenue generators. There are a lot of kind of major elements here when we think about business model. And here are, kind of most of those things, the product, the market, the customer and the value, the pricing, which pricing is not just the kind of what you're actually going to sell it for, but pricing actually factors into the how much did I make on this? And then kind of that marketing approach, operational parameters, scaling, The ones highlighted in yellow here are the ones that we're actually going to kind of talk about in detail, and we've been talking about in detail because those are the ones that actually get you started into this cycle. And they're also the things that are kind of highlighted here on what's called the business model canvas. Now the BMC, and you've probably heard it referred to as BMC, if you've ever been through an ICOR cohort, you probably look at this thing and dread just hits your face. You go, oh God, I've seen this thing so many times. But there's a reason it's utilized, because this kind of gets you just a better understanding of those, key areas. And it's really kind of broken into two halves. You have the left half and you have the right half. And it's not really, down the line, but the ones on the right hand side really talk about the kind of internal aspects of what your business model is. So knowing your customer, knowing who they are, knowing how you've actually developed that relationship with them, knowing how you're going to reach them, which is things like channels, and knowing the value you're going to deliver to them. Those are all those external things. It is a external facing, okay, A to B. You're my customer, let me talk to you. You're my customer, let me find you. You're my customer, let me deliver something to you. And then the ones on the other side, the left-hand side, as you look at the thing, those are kind of the external things. Those are the things that are not necessarily out of your control, but they're not the direct kind of revenue drivers that make up the part of your business plan. Those are the things that you need to think about, like for the future, like activities, resources, and partnerships. That's how you're going to grow. That's how you're, going to deliver, areas like that. So when we talk about kind of revenue generators, what we're really focusing on is that right-hand portion, which were the things that were highlighted in yellow on that previous slide. And this is just that high level modeling. Again, y'all are just starting out. Even when you get into like the presentation you're going to give at the end of this cohort, you don't have to have these things like figured out down to a finite level. We want a general idea. If you tell me that this is your customer, well, why do you think they're your customer? If you tell me that, this is the value proposition, why do you think it's the value proposition? So these are just ways and areas for you to kind of start to lay things out and get your assumptions down on paper, and then kind of start to take a critical look at what those assumptions are. Because these are, again, all elements you're going to need going forward. Whether you go for private investment, even whether you go for, public investment, like SBIRs. And for NIH in a phase 2, when you have that commercialization plan, you're going to need to know these things. You're going to need to have a really good idea about these things, and you're going to need to explain why. But if you go after another agency that has, health potential, like, NSF or DoD or NASA or USDA, which they actually do have crossovers in health out of the other agencies. Those are probably the biggest leaning. These are things you're going to have ideas about now. Most other agencies, you're going to have ideas about your commercialization, your commercial plan, your market, your business in that phase 1 application. And if you do go out for private investment and investors, they're going to want to know this information now as well. So that's why we kind of really focus on that when we talk about the presentation. So just kind of real quick wrap up on, kind of that revenue generation. So you always, again, need to think about that positive progression. Your business model should be, built around reaching goals and, kind of growing it over time. Again, you can't just offer the same exact thing to people and get them to buy it time over time over time again. There has to be those differentiations from it. There has to be those kind of upgrades, companions, new innovations, everything like that. But it has to be believable. That's a really big thing that actually comes about. And most of y'all are scientists, you're researchers, you're faculty members. You know that you can't just say something on a paper and have people believe it. You can't publish a paper and say, well, actually, the gravity constant, rather than being, 9.8 meters per second, is 6.2 meters per second. Everybody's going to go, what do you mean? Where'd you get that? How'd you verify that? How'd you validate that? Where's your source for that? Where's your citations? Who else said that? Because that sounds crazy. Very similar here with business information. Well, what's the source for that? Why do you think that? You can't tell someone that you're going to capture, 50% of a $3 billion market in 5 years. You may think you're going to be able to, but that's a 20-year progression to get into there. And then to capture 50%, that's a huge chunk of, that market itself. If you're going to be making that kind of, money, again, you have to spend money to make money. You're probably looking at a $50 billion outlay to make that $3 billion. Just because, again, you have to get out there, you have to make people interested, you have to get them to know you, you have to provide something that is different from everybody else. And you're probably not even going to be able to capture 1% of that market. But when you think about those kind of market factors and that market differentiation, you need to start kind of thinking about that. Okay, well, how do I get into that? How do I make my name known? And then how do I actually go from that 1% to that 3%, or go from that 3% to that 5%? Before we get into the next section, I'm going to open it up for questions. I see that there is a question here. Will you provide an example of a BMC? What is a channel? Yeah, there's actually a lot of click on the screen. There's actually a lot of really great examples of BMCs out there. I didn't include one in here, but I'll actually drop a couple of them in Slack. There are people that actually have done BMCs for like developed companies. If you do a Google search for BMC, like Coca-Cola, there are people that have actually filled one out for like Coca-Cola, Tesla, Canon, a bunch of like big names that kind of show people what that business model canvas is. But just to kind of dive into like a little bit deeper level here. So segments are those differentiations between kind of customers, because when you think customer, you need to think, what is that person? What is their job? And so if your customer is, someone in, project management and construction, then a segment might be people that are in, a construction industry that makes, less than 5 million a year, less than 10 million a year, because their needs are going to change. So those segments are actually how those needs change and where those people fall within that, just umbrella. But channels are how you reach them. So channels are things like, digital distribution. Channels are things like, TikTok, social media. Channels are how you're going to inform people. So whether it is that, you're on social media to let them know about what you're doing and to make them interested, or, whether you're going to things like conferences and you're having those, discussions with, representatives of those large companies, that's actually a channel. So the channel is just how you're going to reach those people to get them to be your customer. And a lot of times, particularly in y'all's cases, your first channel is probably going to be to go to a health focused conference around the specific malady you're trying to, solve, or, the specific way that you're doing something. There's all sorts of conferences and expos and everything else, all year long if you want to go to them. But, typically you'll have those one or two big ones that, the Johnson and Johnsons, or, the Adexos and all those others will actually be at. And that channel could be, okay, well, I'm going to go to there. I know that they have, liaison people there. I'm going to talk to them. So that can actually be a channel, because it is that I'm making an introduction between myself and my potential customer. But I'll drop some examples of a filled out business model canvas for, large companies in Slack. But any other questions about kind of revenue and revenue generation? don't have questions. Actually, I have a question for you, Chris, because I know that you've worked on both phase one and phase twos.
Yeah.
Like where you've seen people like create a commercialization plan in a phase two, and you look at their, assumptions, or you look at that revenue generation. Do you have like two or three things that always stick out to you that you go, yeah, this is a bad commercialization plan?
Yeah. So you covered one of them. I think people always think making big projections is going to be impressive, and they're most often not believable. So, I expect to see numbers of market acquisition in the single digit percentile for their first 5 years or something. I mean, saying you're going to capture 50% or 20% or 18% of a market is a huge stretch. So unrealistic market goals. The other thing that I see frequently that really is a red flag for me is when people talk about selling directly to, let's use medical device, for example, selling directly to hospitals. And they say, we're going to sell to hospitals. And it sounds like, so, oh, yes, of course, you're going to pick up the phone and call a hospital and they're going to buy your product. That is not how it works. And so discussions and commercialization plans where it's clear the company does not understand the sales process for the market that they're targeting, I think is a huge red flag. So being really clear about how people make buying decisions in that market you're targeting. And I think the other thing is, especially with medical device, a lot of times we can go, you don't have to pick just one, so a lot of times you can go sell to hospitals, but you could also go direct to consumer. And it's fine to say you're going to lead with one and then sort of explore the other later on. So, sort of being open to shifts, I think, is important as you learn things.
Well, and I think it's really interesting that you highlighted that, not understanding things like the sales cycles for hospitals, because that really does speak to those things like channels. If,
Yeah.
as Chris said, you say, well, we're going to sell to these 600 hospitals and we're going to go talk to the hospital administration. It's like, that's not how that process works.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Typically, you get an introduction and then you kind of, build up from there.
yeah, and I think even saying you're going to sell to hospitals, we're really looking for, well, what's your initial market? Is it hospitals with 200 beds or less? Is it hospitals in the Midwest? Is it hospitals that are owned by private foundations? Like really hone in and shrink that initial market down to the most low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, because that is you just covered customer segmentation perfectly. Because
There you
those
go.
different customers are those different hospitals. Those
Yeah.
are different segments. Their needs are going to be different. The value you deliver to them different. The way you actually deliver to them is different. It's not that they can't be your customer, but not everyone and everything is going to be
Yes.
a customer.
Yes. Yes. That is a good way of saying it. I think people often assume, oh, if I just say everybody wants it and I'm going to sell to everybody, it's better. It's the opposite.
Yeah, no, it immediately makes me go, okay, I would need to read back through this because these people are out to lunch. They
Yeah.
have no idea
Yeah.
what they're talking
Right.
about.
Yeah.
And so that's why, that believability is such a huge factor.
Yeah.
But, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So diving into kind of the next section. So we've kind of hit on it when we talked about market, but, what do we actually mean by a market? Well, your market is, again, that kind of definable group of people that not only will buy, but want to buy. Because it's not just that people would purchase, it's that people will want to purchase it. Because when we talk about market, there are competing factors you need to think about. See a couple questions dropped into the chat. Let me kind of get through the information in this slide and I'll address those. So again, kind of when you talk about your market, you're often talking about, you'll hear terms thrown around like TAM, SAM, and SOM. TAM is total addressable market. SAM is serviceable addressable market. And then you have SOM, which is serviceable obtainable market. And all you really need to know is that those things exist within, let me find, okay, I do have a chart that shows that. Those things kind of are that moving down from the idea that, like Chris just brought up, everybody's going to buy this. Okay, well, when you say everybody, who do you mean by everybody? It's like, oh, well, we mean hospitals. Well, when you say hospitals, who are you actually talking about? What's hospitals that are this size? Okay, that's your actual service attainable market, because those are the people that you can actually deliver to. Now, the people that you may be able to deliver to in the future, that's that addressable market. That's that we have to get to this certain place before we can actually potentially be, within this. And then the, total one is just everybody out there in the world. So when you look up market data, oftentimes, you'll go on like Google and you'll say, okay, well, I want to know what the market is for insulin. And you look that up and you get a fact, a data point of like, $18 billion. And you go, that's my market. No, it's not. 18 billion is everybody out there in the world. It's everybody that could actually take it. But then again, there is those stratiations that, like Chris and I just talked about for, okay, well, when you talk about that, then you have things like regions. Then you have things like, okay, well, when we talk about a region, here's what we're actually talking about. Then you have like those applications and you have those, systems. You can't mix like hardware and software if all you're making is software. You're not going to sell to the hardware people because you don't meet their need. And so that's why you kind of have to go from, I look this up, it's an $18 billion market, and you say it's an $18 billion market. That's not actually your market. You really need to talk about that actionable market. And that actionable market is that serviceable, obtainable market. Those are the people that you can deliver to within, let's call it the next 3 to 5 years. They're going to have something. They're going to want something. They're actually going to be able to purchase something from you because you can reliably give it to them. I have a couple slides here that actually focus on education technologies, because there's a lot of data out there on those that kind of just talk you through that. But it's like that difference between a $230 billion market and an $8 billion market. It's could be things like the difference between, including, digital whiteboards and massively online, whatever MMOs stand for, massively online courses. And those systems that kind of deliver it. You can't tell someone that you have an $18 billion market and then they go, well, what about this person? And you go, well, they're not my customer. Well, but that's part of that market. So that's why you need to start kind of looking at, when you look at market data, actually look at those things that, take them out of that larger bubble and start to drop them into different buckets, because you really need to tell us what is your bucket. Question in the chat, is there a model for calculating the cost for a product? There's an overall model for calculating the cost. The thing that affects that model is when you look, there are calculators online, and I'll find a good one that I like and I'll drop it into Slack for people. But the weird thing about when you start to calculate cost for a product is you start to run into God, what is it? The word just escaped me. But it's essentially like over time it gets cheaper to actually make like 10,000 of something versus one of something. So when you look at those, like, calculating cost for a product, your assumptions are going to be typically based off of one. Whereas if you're going to do 10,000 of them, your actual costs are going to go down probably by 20 to 30%. But when you're thinking about like your cost for a product, it has to include how do you make it? So the raw goods that go into it, but then also the time, because generally from when you make something or when you actually get in the raw goods to actually make it to when you ship it out as a product, you're probably talking about a 30 to 60-day timeline. So you have to figure out like, well, how much is it costing me to have those things? Yeah, economy of scale. Thank you. It's a very common term that I just could not remember for a moment there. So yeah, when you think about economies of scale, like if I went out and I bought, 10,000, pins, sure, I'm going to pay more for those 10,000 as a group than I'm going to pay for a single one. But because I bought so many of them, I got a price break. So when you break it down on those economies of scale, that 10,000, an individual pin is going to be cheaper than when I bought that single one. But as a small startup, you're probably not going to be able to, buy those 100,000, quantities of, those raw materials or those goods that you're doing that transformation process on at the beginning. You're going to have to kind of just scale up to it. So that's why, doing things like calculating the cost for a product, it's going to change over time and it's actually going to drop in price. If it rises over time, you're doing something wrong. You need to rethink your manufacturing process or your distribution process or your logistics chain or something like that. But I'll find something that'll be a good kind of just initial calculator for people. That's also a really great thing to talk to your mentors about is just how do I figure this out? Here's what I'm thinking are these, good assumptions for how much my product might cost. Um, and then a question for how much needs to be defined for the first SBIR. So again, kind of for that first one, if you're going after, because we're focusing on NIH here, so let's just talk about NIH. In an NIH phase one, you're not going to have a lot of information. And we're going to talk about this very detailed when Chris presents on the proposal package and what goes into it in week 12 or whatever week it is. But for a phase one, you're probably only going to have about a paragraph of information when you talk about that kind of commercialization, that market, that customer, but then you're going to have reinforcement information throughout. And I'm not going to talk much about that because again, does an excellent job about describing that. So just know that you're not going to have a heck of a lot of that information for your phase one, but you need to be able to, make that kind of, even if it is an overview, again, it just needs to be that kind of logical information about that overview. So when we look up things like market, you're often going to get kind of, charts like this that just give you a data point and then show that growth over time. We didn't actually, I meant to, have it as a question with Arsh last week, but we didn't get into it when he, talked about kind of market and talking to things like investors about your market, or even like an SBIR. If you go out there and you find any of these like market report sites, like one here, Fortune Business Insights, or even Arsh brought up like Mordor Intelligence, they'll give you like an overview. And doing a Google search, you'll find other ones like Market and Markets and stuff like that. And then they'll say, well, if you want more information, we'll sell you a market report. I would say for the first 5 to 10 years of your business, those market reports are going to sell you, not going to be super valuable to you. Those market reports cost, 15, 20, $25,000 just for one report. But you'll get information and you'll be able to kind of make those logical conclusions from it just by doing something like, a Google search and looking at their overview pages. You'll get an example like this, which is something I pulled directly off of Google. And it goes, okay, well, 2021 to 2022, I see a number for the market, but I really want to know what the 2030 is, but I don't have that. Well, the way that they got the number from 2021 to 2022 is there's that thing called CAGR, which is that annual growth rate. And they go, based on this percentage, we think this market is going to grow over time. Well, that CAGR is their estimation. And it's an estimation typically off of like the last 5 years. And they have the projections, though, that will reach 2030. So if you figure out from this data point what that growth rate is between 2021 to 2022, well, you can estimate 2030 because the growth rate stays the same. So whenever you're trying to like figure this type of information out, whether it's for a proposal package, whether it's for an investment pitch, whether it's for the presentation at the end of our cohort, don't spend money to get this information. Because again, we just want to know those kind of overalls. And those overalls are something you can really kind of just have that big idea on just based off of what is, out there. And what kind of makes sense to you. This is just a real quick kind of example of what those different TAM, SAM, and SOM concepts look like. Again, TAM is the overall people. When we were talking, it's like hospitals. Hospitals would be the TAM. And the SAM would be, okay, well, it's hospitals actually in, the US or hospitals within this state. But then the SOM is, okay, well, it's hospitals within the state that have, 200 beds or less, or whatever that kind of walk it down concept is. Because you need to be able to walk it down. If you get into, even in your proposal, like a phase 2 proposal, and you say that my market is, a global market of this, it's like, no, it's really not. It's who can you reliably deliver something to in the next 3 to 5 years to start making money, which is that SOM. It's that first, Chris brought up this term of low hanging fruit. It's that first reliable way that you can start to generate that revenue. But I already talked about kind of don't pay for information, but here's just really that kind of validation on it. When you're thinking about things like, again, markets, customers, competition, everything like that, you need to just be able to pull some information together. It doesn't have to be, okay, well, within a 99% confidence level, because, we've paid for this, we've looked at this. It's just overall, this is what I think. And here's the reasoning for why I think that. Those are the hallmarks of being able to make those good assumptions, because you're taking in that information probably from different sources, and just being able to compile those sources together and go, here's what actually makes sense to me, and here's why it makes sense to me. So segmentation. Segmentation is a really big thing when we think about, our customers and our market, because that segmentation is what drives you to that, SOM or SOM. It is that you're going to have people that have, some sort of overlap, but they're going to be different areas that a market can actually be, kind of subdivided into. And you'll have to actually see this when you go out there and, do some searches for something. And it talks about segmentation as you'll have things like a region segmentation, and they're region bound because, customers in North America are probably going to be different than customers in like Europe, or customers in they call it the MENA, Middle East and North Africa, or customers in Asia Pacific. All of those people are going to kind of be different based on a region and based on a geography, because it's a lot easier to move a product from, let's say, Chicago to El Paso than it is to get it from Chicago to London. Sure, there are flights that go out every day, but then you have to think about regulations, restriction controls. You have to think about the logistics of getting it from the, an international airport into getting it to a delivery, or getting it onto a train system or something like that. That's that kind of differentiation between I can reliably do this and I can theoretically do this. Those reliability factors are what drives that figuring out those segments down into that SOM. You also have things like service bound. So different services are different types of customers, and you're delivering different things. You'll have things like hardware versus software, or hardware, software, and service. Because I realize service bound kind of overlaps there, but service as just a concept. You don't really deliver a product to someone. The product you deliver is yourself. So, for example, these cohorts, even though you're not paying for it, you're a customer of them. You're dedicating time to actually sit here, and we're providing a service. We're providing you knowledge. We're providing you information. That's the value proposition that we deliver. That's actually the product that we are delivering to y'all. And you're a customer segment, so you are service bound. Now, if we were offering a piece of software, you probably wouldn't be our customers, because just giving you a piece of software without telling you how to use it, that's a big difference. So when you think about those kind of service bound, And then you think about type bound, and type bound a lot of times actually dive into the kinds of product. So, when we talk about common medications, you'll have an injectable, you'll have a pill, you'll have an implantable device. And those can all be the same, actually, targeting the same disease or targeting the same malady. Maybe some people need a, once a day pill to, solve it. Maybe some people need a, once a, month injection. Maybe some people need a, implantable. Um, Actually, I don't know why I always go back to diabetes and insulin. I guess just because it's such a common thing that a lot of people kind of understand it. But getting back into something like diabetes, you have people that actually take care of that with a really quick injection, and you have people that actually have a device that's implanted into them that, gives them that, essentially drip of insulin that they would need. But it's still actually delivering the same product, still delivering insulin to them. It's just people that would have that, you know, once a day injection or once a whatever injection versus the device that's implanted into them. They're type bound because it's a different thing that is actually being driven. It's a different thing that actually is being delivered to them based on their particular needs. Are another way to think about it, their kind of segmentation. And then there are also things like, drivers, which drivers are the factors that actually change the market over time. Drivers are almost always outside of your control. They're external factors. So drivers are things like competition, regulations, environment, state of the industry. When, I guess, just as a really quick example, only things like tariffs get passed on something, and that can actually change the market because all of a sudden the customer's not willing to accept that price, and accept the increase in that price that is driven by, something like a tariff. So that's totally outside of your market, but that has actually shifted the market away from you because all of a sudden you can't deliver to that customer now. But, and that's a market driver. And these aren't things that you need to be, you need to know specifically. They're just things that could potentially happen that you need to be aware of because they're things that you need to watch out for. Because as your potential market shifts over time, it can grow or it can stagnate or it can actually reduce. But you don't have to know how it's going to, grow. Don't have to actually know, okay, well, there's going to be this exact percentage because of this exact reason. There's nothing that's going to change it, or it's not going to move at all because of this reason, or it's going to actually, decrease by this specific amount. You just have to kind of be aware that, okay, this can grow over time because of these outlying factors, right? This can actually stagnate over time because of these things. Let's see, question from the chat. What determines your SOM? So we actually dove into that, pretty well here. When you think about your segmentation, that actually drives your SOM, is that kind of segmentation. But for instance, do production and distribution capabilities dictate the SOM, or does your SOM tell you what production distribution facilities are needed? What's the usefulness of the SOM? So again, that kind of SOM is that kind of first, customer. They're the ones you're going to be, reliably able to deliver to. Production and distribution capabilities do actually factor into that. You can't say that you're going to have a customer that, goes from, people in, Padoken, wherever that is, I think it's Illinois, all the way out to, Lisbon, Portugal. But you don't have a way to actually ship and deliver goods internationally. Well, they're not going to be that customer then. They're not going to be that ones that are really obtainable to you. Obtainable a lot of times is driven by regional influencers. So things like that, production and manufacturing. If you can only deliver 100,000, but you have customers that want 1 million of them, well, they're not really going to be your customers because they can't wait, 10 years for you to actually be able to give them 1 million of something. They need it now. They need it, within the next 6 months. So if you can't deliver those levels of product, well, then they're not going to be that kind of low-hanging fruit because they'll go to someone else. So yes, that production, distribution, scaling, all of that stuff will actually factor into figuring out what is that first entry point. Because your SOM really is that first entry point. It is who you can reliably have give you money for what you're doing in the next, again, 3 to 5 years. But just to kind of show you a couple of these like segmentation things in action here, and need to start to move kind of quickly through some of this information. So when you look at, like your market, and you go out there and get a market report, you have things here like, the Asia Pacific education technology market and preschool, K to 12, higher education, and others. And those are going to start to talk about those segments, but for you to be able to reliably pull information, well, they want you to buy a report, and they want you again to buy one of those expensive reports. But know that they're making estimations, and their estimations don't really kind of shift and change over time. Like if you look at the distribution for that 2020, the percentages in that really are kind of the same as that percentages in 2030, because these people don't know it either. They're not Nostradamus. They're not making, those crystal ball and, Miss Cleo and see it all. They're just making their own guesses and estimations. So if you look at here and say, this looks like it's about, 40%, that's fine enough. You just say how you got to that 40%. So looking at these, and a lot of these you can kind of eyeball, and eyeballing it is good enough because you've gone to an outside source that has used their own methodologies and information to actually develop this. And as Chris said in the chat, there's a lot of these kinds of market sites that you can actually get information from your university subscriptions. So take a look at those. But here's just another example. And again, just kind of eyeballing stuff for the purposes of your proposal, for the purposes of, your presentation, for the purposes of just a general pitch. Just being able to eyeball these is a good enough factor. And just one more example here of kind of what those different like market factors and market categorizations will look like. And then, just that. So again, kind of market is a really big factor in just knowing who your customer is, knowing where they are, and just helping you kind of figure out that, what is that commercial product that you're going to be able to deliver. Because that, business plan or business planning or revenue generation plan, they need to be developed around the market. Because if you don't know your market, you don't know your revenue streams. If you don't know your customer, you don't know your market. If you don't know the value that you deliver, you don't know your customer. These all kind of feed into each other for making those, correct assumptions and being able to explain why they're the correct assumptions. And again, these are going to be super important for your phase 2. They're going to be a little bit important for your phase 1, just to be able to explain that you will have a commercial product in the future. But it does really influence things like those investment pitches or, other agencies, and just being able to be vital information for kind of securing funding in the future. Let's see, we already talked about all of these. Sorry, I just realized that we're getting shorter on time, so flipping past the ones that were just, reinforcement information. But you have to, again, with the market, kind of just make sure that the inferences are actually factual. From those images that I pulled up, or even from the descriptions that you'll find on a lot of those online sources, just pull something out from there that goes, okay, well, this backs this up. This is a reliable point of data because it came from this outside group. And just like everything else, try to stick with, first source information. If you're looking at a site that says, well, we got our information from this company who got this information from this company who got this. It's like playing a game of telephone. When it goes through 3 or 4 different channels before it reaches you, you don't know how reliable it is. And a lot of those sites will actually tell you like where they generated the information from. Try to stick to those ones that said that they, did first party information, or, they generated themselves based off of, phone calls that they had, or, discussions that they had with people. Because you just want to know that kind of overall investability of the innovation, whether it is for investment or whether it is for public or private investment. They need to know that there's going to be a payoff and a turnaround. And but the other kind of factor in there is, don't just take that information as, the holy Bible of what your market is. Start to go out there and, validate it yourselves. A lot of small startups just kind of get that information and their market information wrong because they don't, focus down, and they don't look at those kind of bigger picture of the influences that can actually change and shift that market over time, and those kind of risk points. Again, really reinforcing here that your customer kind of is king. Not understanding your customer and not being able to identify them actually causes cascading issues that causes your entire business plan or revenue generation plan to completely fall apart. Everything that you do is going to be kind of focused around customer first, because the customer is the one that's going to give you money. Yes, you can have a user that's actually going to benefit from it, but your customer is the one that ultimately pays for it. So how do you deliver something to that customer? And have just a couple slides here on competitors and differentiators. But competition is, part of your market, and again, part of that kind of revenue generation, because they're the people that you're going to take, share away from. And that share is just how much of that, market are you able to capture? Because you can't capture 100% of it. If you factor it down to the, well, I'm going to be able to, deliver to 100% of these people because there's only 12 of them, that's not really a good market, because where do you go in the future? But just to back up, everybody has competition. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Sometimes the status quo is that actual competition. Great example here where I say, don't pull a Jurassic Park fallacy. If somebody actually created Jurassic Park, you would think, well, there is no competition for that. There's nobody else that actually has dinosaurs. And sure, but that's also the difference between direct and indirect competition, because they don't have direct competition, but at the end of the day, entertainment is their competition, because people have a finite amount of money to spend on things. So their competitors would actually be things like Disney World, the movies, Netflix. People spend a certain amount of money to be entertained. They need to show that people should be able to, be willing to give up 10 to 15 years of that entertainment just for that one-time experience. And so that's why anytime you talk to someone and you catch yourself saying, well, I don't have any competitors, know that you're about to tell them one of the biggest lies you can tell them as a business. Think outside the box. You have to think about those other things that actually can affect it. Because those direct competitors offer a product that is very similar, solves a similar problem. And those indirect product competitors are those, different products that actually solve a related issue or problem, but can be used. Perfect example here is something like Ozempic versus diet pills. Ozempic was first created to solve a very specific problem, but now you have people that are actually using it for, critical obesity, and being able to actually, stave off hunger controls long enough that they can actually lose weight or inhibit those hunger controls. So it's not just that you have somebody out there that has that exact same, painkiller with that non-opioid base that you have, but who else is within that realm? How else do people solve that problem? And so that's why that kind of customer validation and interview process that Arsh talked about last week is so critical here, because you can't just assume that you know exactly what somebody suffers from, or exactly what their pain point is, or exactly how they're, solving it, without kind of thinking about that kind of larger scale and talking to them. How are they solving it now? What is something they wish it did? What is something that actually influences and affects them? And what is the initial critical issue that causes them to go out there and try and solve this problem? And when you talk about competition, kind of the big thing that to focus on is just how are we different than what is already out there? This gets into that aspect of differentiation. What makes you different than the other things that people are doing? What makes you different than like what Advil delivers, or what Canon delivers as a printer? How does that actually line up with that comparison chart? Which that was that thing I flipped past. That was the table that was here. Realize I put it in the wrong area when we were going through it. But this would be something like that kind of comparison chart where you say, this is what we do, this is what we deliver, here's how it stacks up against the competition. You should have a lot more check marks in this area than you do those X's where you go, well, we just don't do this. If you have more X's when you actually develop one of these, then you know what? You're probably looking at the wrong market, and you're probably looking at the wrong customer, because you need to be able to deliver something greater than what's already out there, or something more impactful than what people can already get. Let's get back to here. Okay. And then don't worry about everybody else out there. You can't compete against every other thing under the sun all at the same time. What you're really worried about are those kind of big drivers, those names people just go, well, I know this person, I'm just going to buy from them. You kind of have to think about where they sit. You're probably actually not going to be directly competing against those guys again for quite a while. When you think about, can I reliably deliver something? Can I reliably deliver it in this number? Can I reliably deliver it to this area? And just always be aware of the state of the industry. You don't want to have the market shift away from you, right out from under your feet, because somebody else came up with a different idea that is better than yours, and you didn't actually change it over time. And just kind of lastly about those differentiators, there should be big differences in how you approach solving the problem and what others are currently doing, to solve the problem. Because that is the heart of innovation. That's the critical driver. That's what actually makes it innovative, is that differentiation. I always like to tell people that, people often get innovation wrong because they think innovation means high tech. But at the heart of it, innovation means that you're doing something for greater benefit for less resources. That's what innovation actually turns out to be. People get something greater from you without having to give up more to actually get it. And kind of knowing that drives understanding why customers come to you and why customers would actually seek you, because that's kind of that idea behind value proposition. And let's see, before I jump into these last areas here, a question in the chat. If they channel a product through Walmart or Home Depot, can their market reach in different parts of US be used for market share? It can. It depends on kind of what that distribution agreement will look like, because when you approach a large vendor like that, because they're actually, it depends on whether they're buying from you or whether they're actually just an intermediary. Somebody like Walmart or Home Depot, typically those large retail stores are buying from you, but at the end of the day, they're going to be your customer. The people that buy from Home Depot or Walmart are the end users. Those people aren't actually your customer because they're not buying directly from you. So that gets into thinking kind of more globally when you look at something like your business model canvas, because if you're relying on them as a channel, well, they're buying the product from you. So just by definition, they are your customer. So then you have to start thinking about, okay, well, how do I actually deliver to Walmart? Do I have to get it to, well, it's not even in Fayetteville anymore, whatever small Hodum town in Walmart that their head distribution center and stuff is in. Or can it actually be a drop location, or do they come pick it up from me? And are they making a purchase order of 1,000 units, every day, or is it 10,000 units a month? Or that actually gets into that. No, when you think of like a channel like them, they're not a channel, they're a customer, because they are that kind of first stream of revenue to you. So knowing that they are your customer, you actually look at different markets too, because then you're looking at, okay, well, large retail stores buy these different products because it does X. The users that are buying it, they may be the ones that get the biggest benefit from you, and this actually gets into value proposition. You have to convince, like that Walmart or the Home Depot, that you offer a value to them, because their customers are looking for your product. Their customers gain some benefit, which is going to equal bigger sales for them. At the heart of it, a lot of times when you're looking at those types of organizations as your customer, green is the color of the world. It's all about, making money or, keeping costs down. So you have to describe to them how you're either going to keep costs down, or how you're going to allow them to actually make more money for them to be your customer. And this actually gets into the last bullet point here when we talk about value proposition. That value proposition is related to those specific segments. Getting back into one of the like earlier slides that showed like segments between like a pre-K classroom and a high school classroom. Well, their value for that pre-K classroom is going to be very different than that high school classroom. And that's why that segment is very different, because what that pre-K classroom needs is going to be very different than what that high school classroom needs. And your value proposition is driven around that customer need and that pain point that they want to actually solve. But price alone is never a value proposition. Price can be a very big indicator of a value, and it can actually be kind of that tipping point that makes someone flip from being a outlier into a customer. But it's never just about cost savings, or it's never just about we reduce this, because there's unintended consequences. You don't know their production facilities. Like if you were being able to deliver to them a new type of manufacturing machine, and you go, we'll save you $10,000 per production run. Great. Okay, it's going to cost you $50 million to actually integrate this into your current production line. Well, they're not your customer, because they're going to go, well, we're not going to spend $50 million to save $10,000 each run. Or think about like if you saw a 60-inch plasma TV for $50, you don't go, well, I'm their customer, I'm going to rush out and buy that. First thing you think about is what is wrong with that TV that it's, a tenth of the price of anybody else. So it can never just be about price. There has to always be some other benefit that people would get from the product, and that actually flips it into that value. And that's why value proposition is benefit driven, not cost driven. But again, that kind of value proposition is very guided by your customers. Next week, we're actually going to talk about customers. So we're going to really dive down into, value proposition and how that is delivered and why that actually kind of makes sense. So a lot of these things that we talked about with like segmentation, and even for like the questions about knowing your service obtainable market, again, your customer is the driving factor for that. And next week, yes, is when we're actually going to be talking about those customers. Because if you have to really work at convincing someone why they should value what you're creating, it's probably not actually a big value to them. If you have to have, multiple conversations, you have to have, a 10-minute conversation about the product, and you have to constantly go, well, but let me tell you about this. And I don't know, maybe you're maybe not be actually talking about the right value for them. When we think value proposition, it should be that almost immediate, okay, I get this, I understand this, tell me a little bit more about it. You shouldn't be doing, like a used car pitch, a used car salesman pitch, just to make them go, yeah, okay, maybe I'll actually value this. But real quick, mapping this to the SBIR and STTR, again, for an NIH phase one, it's not, super relevant to have this information, in a very finite amount or very finite example, but you're going to need some overall ideas. There is some information that's going to go into that proposal package. Generally, it's going to be, kind of the customer, why they're a customer, what that kind of potential market's going to be. But you really need to understand that value proposition, though, to know why what you're doing is innovative. Because, the difference between invention and innovation is that product development. Invention is about finding out more about the problem. Innovation is about creating something to solve the problem. But you don't know if you're actually solving the problem unless you understand the value that it brings to the table and the benefit that people will actually get from it. Because it's not really a product if nobody buys it. And nobody's going to buy it if they don't get a benefit out of it. There's not some value that they get out of it. And people value what is different that saves them time, resources, money, cost, ability to do something, lives, whatever it is, it has to have that inherent saving ability into it. But so that's our kind of session for this time. Next session we're going to, oh, I didn't change this. But we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the business model strategies and just kind of understanding customers, reaching your customers, which gets into those kind of ideas about channels. And we're also going to talk about intellectual property, because that's always a big hot button issue for people. And the homework is just to start thinking about, what is your market? Who is your market? Why is that market expansive? How is it expansive? Just have some general ideas about it. And this is also a really great topic to talk with your mentors about, because a lot of people in here just aren't going to, understand that, well, what is my market? How do I define my market? And your mentors can help walk you through that based on what are you making? What does it solve? Who might care about it? Because those are the hallmarks of knowing your market and knowing why it's your market. But we are a little bit over time, but if there are other questions that people want to drop in the chat. Sorry, I realized that I kind of ran through the last two sections there, but that's also part of a big thing about, we're going to really kind of dive into those, that was just an overview about like value proposition and competition. Because when we talk about customers next week, a big part of that is going to be value proposition and competition and knowing they're your customers.
Lots of really great information, Del.
Thank you, Chris. Any last like tidbits you want to share with people about, market or value proposition, particularly as it relates to SBIRs or what you've seen?
No, I think all of that you've talked about today will become, the reason it's so important will become more obvious as we get to that section about preparing your proposal. And hopefully, as you said at the beginning, I think a lot of this ties into sort of knowing the product, giving consideration to your regulatory path. I mean, all of that, it all goes together. So that's why we always have the hardest time figuring out the order to put these things in.
Yeah, and even putting the slides together, when I had that one about, well, knowing your customer and your product is knowing innovation, then I went, oh crap, it kind of really is.
Yeah.
Because if you can't describe this, if you can't describe why someone would want it, and even, like Chris kind of mentioned, we'll talk much more about that when we talk about putting together your proposal. But when we talk about like innovation, that is what innovation is. Like, if you don't know what you're giving to someone that would actually benefit for them, then you don't really know if you're innovative, let alone why you're innovative.
Yeah. No, it's all great information for sure.
Like there are no other questions. So if there aren't, sorry I took over a couple minutes over. Oh, there's a question. If there are no other drugs in a disease space, how would you phrase value proposition? It seems obvious and intuitive. It's actually a great question because that does get into you always have competition. So if there are no other drugs in that particular disease space, well, how do you define your value proposition? Well, what actually are the effects of that disease? What are the impacts of that disease? That actually gets into a concept called economic impacts. I will say that, and I've seen this actually a lot of times with NIH in particular and SBIR. If you have something in there about the economic impacts of a disease, reviewers go gaga over that. Have you seen that as well, Chris?
Yeah, we certainly talk about that a lot. And you're probably getting to this, but the disease is currently treated somehow. And so that's your initial competition, is the current methods.
Yeah.
Whether that's off-label drug use or poor patient quality of life, whatever it is, that's the competition.
Yeah, because if the ultimate, like if there is a certain disease that is not treated now and has a 100% mortality rate, well, that's the value that you actually bring. But again, when you talk about stuff like that, you're talking about a lot of regulatory and reimbursement. So this gets into the differentiation between a user and a customer. Is your customer is more than likely going to be that hospital system, or it's going to be that insurance company, and you actually give them a savings over time, because if that patient doesn't die, well, then they don't have like an insurance company won't have like a payout or something like that, or they won't have to continue to pay for that person's progressive treatments as the ailments worsen. Or for a hospital, you won't have those constant reoccurrences of the person being there if you can actually solve the problem. So, that gets into figuring out how you actually impact something, is where you start to like drill down into that value proposition. Because again, a lot of times it is based on that, well, we save this, but it can't just be okay, well, if you buy this drug for this person, you save $4. Well, what does that $4 actually do for me? For a hospital, maybe it frees up, personnel so that they can go do something else. They don't have to have a nurse, 24/7, assigned to that person. Or there has to be something that what you're doing will ultimately affect. And as Chris just mentioned, that quality of life for that person or that patient can be a really big factor there. And knowing what does that quality of life improvement actually lead to for someone that provides a point of care.
Sure.
Any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and end today's session. Realize that a lot of this is just super high level stuff that is very, very abstract. That's why talking about these things, you always get like just this kind of brief overview in these group sessions, because in order to understand a concept, you kind of really need to put into, this is how I understand it because I've seen this out in the wild, and kind of making it personal for people. And the way that it actually makes it personal for people, talk to your mentors about this. This is why we have this ability for you to have mentors throughout this cohort. So talk to your mentors about, well, how do I figure out what my value is? And how do I figure out, what my market is, or maybe who my customer is? They'll be a really great sounding board to just walk through the methods, because this is all just kind of experimentation and figuring it out. You don't know someone's your customer until you actually have something that they will buy from you and you try to sell it to them. So right now, you're just making some guesses, but you're making some guesses that have some sort of evidence behind it. It is that almost scientific hypothesis. It's not just a random wild guess of, I don't know, maybe. There's some reasoning behind it. So talk through that reasoning. And again, use the Slack channels if you have greater questions about value proposition or anything like that, and you want to get more opinions about it. Don't hesitate to ping myself through Slack or drop it in the channel. All of this information is one of those things that as we started out this cohort, we talked about you're going to get different viewpoints, but nobody has the answer for you. You have to figure out the answer. We're going to give you our ideas, and we're going to give you our ideas of how we would arrive on the information, but just choose the methodology that makes the most sense to you. Because whether it is in the presentation, whether it's in the proposal, whether it's in partnership agreements in the future, you have to be able to speak confidently and comfortably about the information. And the only way you're going to do that is select the method that makes the most sense to you and that you can actually replicate for yourself. But thank y'all again. And we will see y'all same time, same place next week.
Bye, everybody.